Old biker life means nothing anymore. He said it with a smirk. Then he grabbed the leather jacket, the one she had kept, folded on her late husband's chair for 11 years, and threw it onto the wet ground like it was garbage. Margaret Lawson did not scream. She did not cry. She sat in her wheelchair at the edge of her own porch, watching a stranger erase 30 years of her life in under 4 minutes. He said one thing: "You have no idea what you just did." Before we go further, if this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along to the very end. A comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Richard Caldwell had a rule he lived by. He had never once broken in 22 years of business. Every problem had a price. Every obstacle had a solution. Every person, no matter how stubborn, no matter how many tears they cried, or how many years they had lived somewhere, could eventually be moved. He believed this the way other men believed in God, as a philosophy, not as a business strategy, as a fact of life. On the morning of October 14th, standing in the driveway of a small house on Willow Creek Road in Red Valley, Ohio, Richard Caldwell saw no reason to believe anything had changed. He had driven from his downtown office in his black SUV. Two of his security contractors, big men named Cole and Derek, who wore matching gray polos and said very little. A manila folder with documentation, legal stamps, and a court-issued eviction notice that had cleared every review his attorneys put it through. He had done everything right. He always did everything right. That was how Richard Caldwell had built an empire worth $63 million in a county where most people struggled to afford a mortgage. Parked in the driveway, straightened his jacket, and looked at the house the way a surgeon looks at a patient before the first cut, with complete detachment, pure professionalism, and not a single flicker of what anyone might call feeling. Best house, 2 bedrooms, a covered porch with a wooden ramp built along the side, the kind added for wheelchair access. A garden along the front, wind chimes hanging near the door, and plaque beside the mailbox that read Lawson in faded letters. But Richard noted none of those details. He noted the square footage, size, the location 2 blocks from the new commercial corridor his company was developing. He noted that once this property was cleared and rebuilt, anchor the south end of what his marketing team was already calling Red Valley Commons, a mixed-use development that would bring restaurants, boutique retail, and upscale condominiums to a neighborhood that, in his opinion, had been underperforming for far too long. He noted that this was the last house on the block he needed. Walked to the front door and knocked. The woman who answered was smaller than he expected. He had read the file. 68 years old, disabled, living alone, receiving a modest fixed income, behind on her property taxes, which was, in fact, the legal mechanism his attorneys had used to initiate the eviction process. He had read all of that, but he had not pictured her clearly. He had not pictured anyone clearly. That was another one of his rules. Don't picture the people, picture the property. Margaret Lawson sat in a motorized wheelchair just inside her front door. She was wearing a blue cardigan over a white blouse, and her silver hair was pulled back neatly. Her eyes, and this was the one thing Richard noticed that he had not expected, were completely steady. Not frightened, not desperate, steady. She looked at him the way someone looks at a weather forecast they have already prepared for. "Well," she said. "Not a question, Mrs. Lawson." He held up the manila folder. "I think you know why I'm here." "I do," she said. "Like to come inside?" He almost said yes. He was trained in negotiation, trained to accept invitations that kept people calm, in the moment, that made difficult conversations feel like reasonable exchanges between adults. Thing about the way she asked without the trembling he expected, the pleading, made him decide to stay where he was. "I don't think that'll be necessary," he said. "This won't take long." Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded, very slowly, and said, "All right." Richard laid it out clearly and efficiently. Property tax delinquency, 3 years of accumulating debt, had triggered a legal process that his company had navigated through the proper channels. It purchased the outstanding lien. The court had issued a judgment. The eviction was legal, fully documented, and had been properly served for approximately 3 minutes. When he finished out the folder, "This is your copy of the final documentation," he said. "Until noon today to remove your personal belongings. My team will assist with what can be moved to the curb. Anything remaining after noon becomes property of Caldwell Development." Margaret did not take the folder. She looked at it for a moment, then looked back at him. "He have lived in this house for 31 years, she said. "Understand that," Richard said. "My husband died in this house. I'm sorry for your loss. My daughter took her first steps in that kitchen. Mrs. Lawson, I need more time." Her voice was still steady. Something had moved just beneath it, not grief, not fear, something closer to a kind of warning that Richard was too certain of himself to hear. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that's all I'm asking. I have people I need to call. There are arrangements I need to make. Richard straightened. Date has passed. The grace period has elapsed. I'm not in a position to... You're not in a position, she repeated. Holly, not mocking, just making sure she had heard him correctly. Right. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something, Mr. Caldwell?" He nodded. Already impatient. "Have you ever lost something that couldn't be replaced?" Richard looked at her. About the question the way he thought about most things that didn't have immediate practical relevance, briefly and without real engagement. "Sorry," he said. "I don't have more time this morning. My team will begin now." He turned back toward the driveway and nodded at Cole and Derek. They moved toward the front door. What happened in the next 20 minutes was, any legal standard, completely proper. Cole and Derek were professionals. They were careful. They stacked boxes near the front steps, wheeled out furniture without scratching the walls. They worked quickly and without comment. Richard stood in the driveway, answering emails on his phone. Inside, Margaret Lawson moved from room to room in her wheelchair, watching strangers dismantle her life. She did not interfere. She did not shout at them. She pointed out quietly and without drama. Boxes contained fragile items, a set of dishes she had received as a wedding gift, a collection of ceramic birds her late husband had brought her from trips he had taken with his chapter. Cole wrote down her instructions and followed them. By temperament, a decent man doing a job he didn't love. Colorado, for a while, everything proceeded in the terrible technical way that evictions proceed when everyone is being technical and no one is being human. Richard's phone call ended, and he walked into the house. He went inside because Derek had come out to tell him there was a locked storage cabinet in the back bedroom, and they didn't want to break it open without asking. Richard walked through the living room without looking at it, down the short hallway, toward the back. He passed the bedroom doorway, not because he chose to, not because something sentimental reached him. He stopped because he nearly walked into Margaret's wheelchair. She had maneuvered herself into the narrow hallway and was blocking the path with her body, which was the only tool she had left. "The room," she said, "is not to be touched." Richard looked past her. The open bedroom door. He saw a neatly made bed, a bedside table with a glass of water and a worn Bible. And on a wooden chair beside, the dresser folded with the kind of careful precision that speaks of reverence, a black leather motorcycle jacket. Even from the hallway, Richard could see the patch on the back. The distinctive red and white, the death's head, Hell's Angels. At the jacket, the way he looked at everything in that house as an object occupying space he had already, in his mind, claimed. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "his patience fully spent. Everything in this house becomes property of Caldwell Development at noon. I suggest you focus on what you want to take with you rather than what stays." "That jacket belonged to my husband," she said. "It goes with me when I go. Not a minute before. Then take it. I will take it when I'm ready to go." "Which is not today." He looked at her. He looked at the jacket, and something in him, some tired, irritated, end-of-his-rope version of Richard Caldwell made a decision that the beginning of the morning version of him would never have made. He stepped around her wheelchair, walked to the chair, picked up the jacket, and carried it out of the room. Margaret Lawson's voice, when she spoke, Loud. It was lower than it had been before. A voice that comes not from the throat, but from somewhere deeper, from a place that has seen enough of the world to know exactly what certain moments mean. "Put that down," she said. Richard kept walking. "Mr. Caldwell, I am asking you to put my husband's jacket down." He walked through the living room, door, out onto the porch. He held the jacket at arm's length. For a moment, a gesture that was almost theatrical, almost contemptuous, and then he dropped it. It fell onto the wet ground below the porch steps. The red and white patch faced upward. The death's head stared at the sky. Richard turned back toward the house and said, loud enough for everyone in the driveway to hear, "Old biker life means nothing anymore. Clear the rest." There was a silence then, of silence that is not quiet at all. Cole stopped moving. Margaret looked at the ground. Even the neighborhood, which had been going about its morning, cars passing, a dog barking somewhere down the block, seemed to go still. Margaret Lawson had rolled herself to the front door. She sat in the frame, looking down at the jacket on the wet ground. She did not look at the jacket long. She looked at Richard, and she said very quietly, in a voice that he would hear again in his dreams for a long time after that morning, "I have no idea what you just did." He didn't even look back. Sarah Mitchell was raking leaves in her front yard 2 houses down when she heard the sound of the engines cut off in the Lawson driveway. She was 61 years old, a retired school teacher, and she had lived on Willow Creek Road for 19 years. She knew Margaret the way you know someone who has been your neighbor long enough that their rhythms become part of your own daily life. The smell of Margaret's coffee drifting across the yards on Sunday mornings, the sound of the customized trike, the starting up when the chapter rode together on the last Saturday of every month. She looked up when she heard Richard's voice. She heard the words. She watched the jacket fall. She set down her rake. She went inside her house and picked up her phone. She stood at her kitchen window, looking at Margaret, who was still sitting in the doorway, still looking at the spot where Richard had walked away, and she opened her contacts to a name, Michael Lawson. She typed slowly, as her hands were trembling now in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He threw her out. He came with papers and 2 big men, and he cleared the house. Daniel's jacket in the mud and said, "The biker life means nothing." "She's sitting outside on the porch right now. She won't call you." "No, she won't call you. So I'm calling you." She set her phone on the counter. Then she went back outside, walked down the block, and sat down next to Margaret on the porch steps. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. Sometimes that's the only thing you can give a person, and sometimes it means everything. Margaret didn't speak for a long time. She sat with her hands in her lap, watching Cole and Derek carry the last of her boxes to the curb. She watched Richard Caldwell's black SUV back out of her driveway and disappear around the corner without slowing. She watched a stranger from the development company walk up and change the locks on her front door. She watched it all with the same steadiness she had carried through that whole terrible morning. Her hands in her lap had tightened into fists, and Sarah, sitting close enough to see them, said nothing. After a while, Margaret reached down beside her wheelchair and picked up Daniel's jacket from where someone, Cole, probably he had his small decencies, had retrieved it from the wet ground and folded it over the arm of her chair, it in her lap. She ran her thumb along the patch, the red and white, the lettering that had been on that jacket since 1987. Daniel Lawson was voted in, and the chapter threw him a party that people in Red Valley still talked about nearly 4 decades later. It was an old leather jacket, Margaret said. Sarah waited. "He has no idea what this jacket means." She paused. "He has no idea who I am." Sarah nodded. "My son is going to be angry," Margaret said. Something crossed her face then. Not fear, exactly. Close to the feeling you have when you've spent a long time holding back a tide, and you know the moment is coming when you simply won't be able to hold it anymore. I don't want him angry. I don't want this to become something it doesn't have to become. Margaret, Sarah said carefully. I already texted him. Silence. Margaret turned to look at her. He needed to know, Sarah said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to face the street. Then it's already started, she said. Lawson read the text at a red light 12 miles north of Red Valley. He was 44 years old, built wide through the shoulders from 20 years of working with his hands, first as a mechanic, or later as the owner of a motorcycle repair shop that had become something of a landmark for riders within a 200-mile radius. His father's face and his mother's eyes, and on most days he was a patient man who ran his chapter with a steadiness that the older members said reminded them of Daniel. When he read Sarah's message, he was not patient. As once, he read it again. Then he called his road captain, a man named Brick, who had been riding with the chapter for 16 years and who answered on the second ring. "Got it?" Michael said. "Just now," Brick said. "How fast can you get to the shop?" There was a pause. In the background, Michael could hear the sound of a television being turned off. "It's 20 minutes, Brick said. "Make it 15. What happened at the shop over the next 2 hours was not what television has trained people to expect when they picture a group of Hell's Angels responding to a crisis. There was no table pounding, no shouting, no dramatic speeches about vengeance. Harold sat at the long wooden table in the back room of his shop, the room where the chapter held its meetings, where decisions were made quietly and with the weight they deserved, and he spoke in a voice that was so controlled it was almost frightening. At that table sat 7 men who had been riding with the chapter long enough to understand what Michael's controlled voice meant. He was not managing his anger. It meant his anger was managing him. "Tell me what we know," he said. Brick laid it out. Property tax lien, legal acquisition by Caldwell Development, court-issued eviction, everything properly documented, properly processed, properly rubber-stamped. "And the jacket," Michael said. "Sure." "She confirmed it," Brick said. He picked it up out of the room, carried it to the porch, dropped it. Silence around the table. Michael repeated. "Yes." Michael looked at the table, both hands flat on the wood, and breathed. The other men let him breathe. Then a man at the end of the table, older than the others, gray-bearded, whose road name was Cannon, and who had known Daniel Lawson since before Michael was born, spoke. "No," Cannon said. "He's a real estate man from downtown. He doesn't know who Margaret is. He doesn't know what the jacket means." "That's right," Michael said. "No." He looked up. "He's going to find out." The calls went out that afternoon. Not from Michael directly, or rather not only from Michael, that exists within and between Hell's Angels chapters is not a phone tree or an email chain. It is something older and more organic than that. It is a culture of loyalty so deeply embedded in the identity of its members that when a message of genuine need moves through it, it moves the way water moves downhill. The message was simple. Margaret Lawson Daniels, Margaret, has been put out of her home. Her husband's patch was thrown in the dirt. We're showing up. There's no ask, no obligation, no command, just information. Over hours, phones began buzzing in cities and towns across Ohio and into the bordering states. A chapter president named Warren read the message during his lunch break and immediately started making calls of his own. In Akron, 3 riders who had met Margaret at a rally 6 years earlier and remembered her cooking recognized the name and said yes without having to think about it. Pittsburgh, a chapter whose members had corresponded with the Red Valley chapter for years, passed the message to their own network. Each person who received it made the same calculation, not a strategic calculation, a tactical one, but a deeply personal one. Do I know who Margaret is? Do I know what the jacket means? Do I know what it means to drop a dead man's patch in the mud? The answer again and again was yes. And the answer to the unspoken question that followed the question of whether they would show up was the same. Caldwell did not know any of this. Richard Caldwell was at that same hour sitting in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of his office building, presenting the Red Valley Commons development timeline to a group of investors who had flown in from Chicago and were very pleased with what they were hearing. Willow Creek Road property was listed on the PowerPoint slide as C secured, acquisition complete. Richard moved through the presentation with the ease of a man who has just had a very good morning. He was polished. He was exactly the man he always was in that conference room. But he had no idea. He had no idea that a woman named Sarah Mitchell had sent a text. He had no idea that a man named Michael Lawson was sitting in a motorcycle shop 12 miles away with both hands flat on a wooden table. He had no idea that across 3 states, phones were buzzing and men who had known Margaret Lawson for years were saying to each other, "Wing." He had no idea. Because Richard Caldwell had a rule he lived by. Every problem had a price. Every obstacle had a solution. Every person could eventually be moved. He believed this the way other men believed in God. He had believed it his whole life. He had never once been wrong. By 5 o'clock, Margaret was at Sarah's house. Sarah had insisted, and Margaret, who was not a woman who easily accepted help, had eventually agreed, as the alternative was sitting on the curb beside her stacked boxes until some arrangement could be made. And even Margaret's pride had its limits. They were in Sarah's kitchen when Michael called. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Michael," she said. "Come." His voice was careful, deliberate, the way it got when he was working very hard to hold something steady. "I'm at Sarah's. I'm fine. Good." A pause. "Asking you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right, did he—" Another pause. "Sure." "Did he put his hands on you?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" "No." "But he threw the jacket." It was not a question. It was a statement that was also a verdict. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The whistles. Then she said, "Michael, I don't want you to do anything that's going to cause trouble. I'm an old woman and I need a place to live. That's what matters right now." "You're not an old woman," Michael said. "I'm my mother, and that was my father's patch." "Michael, I'm not going to do anything illegal. I'm not going to do anything dangerous. I'm going to do what Dad would have done." She knew what that meant. She knew it the way you know something that you have known your whole adult life with the bone-deep certainty of long familiarity. Lawson, when someone had wronged a person he loved, not threatened, he did not destroy. He showed up for the people who loved him with him. He stood in front of the problem and let it understand a word of violence, what accountability looked like when it arrived wearing leather. She asked, "Mom, how many?" Another pause, longer. "I don't have a final number yet." Margaret closed her eyes. "Careful," she said. "Always am." "And Michael?" "Yeah. Make sure they know this is about dignity. Not revenge. Your father would want that to be clear." There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Margaret checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Michael said, "Quietly, I know, Mom." "Oh." Richard Caldwell got home at 6:45. Was on the edge of Red Valley's most expensive subdivision, a large craftsman-style home on a professionally landscaped lot with a 3-car garage and a circular driveway. It was beautiful in the way that things built to impress are beautiful. They realized, perfectly maintained and utterly impersonal. He changed out of his suit. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. He sat in the leather chair in his study and opened the financial projections for Red Valley Commons. The 4th time that day, he was the kind of man who did not rest until he had looked at the numbers enough times to feel certain. Wife, Diane, came to the doorway of the study. "Hey?" she asked. "Productive," he said, without looking up. Nodded and disappeared back down the hallway. He read until 9, almost ready to sleep, when his phone lit up with a call from Derek. One of his security contractors, Cole Partner, Colorado's, one of the 2 men who had been at Willow Creek Road that morning. Richard frowned at the screen. Derek had never called him outside of work hours before. He answered, "What is it?" Derek's voice when he spoke was something that Richard took a moment to identify as genuine unease. "Caldwell, I don't know if this is anything. It's probably nothing. You should know." "Know what?" "I was out at Riley's the bar on 4th Street, and I ran into a couple of guys I know from the mechanic crowd, and they were talking about what happened today." Richard's fingers stilled on his glass. "About it. They said, I don't know if this is true. Tell you what I heard. They said that the woman from this morning, that she's connected, like seriously connected." Richard said nothing. "They said her son is the president of the local Hells Angels chapter, and that people have been getting calls all day." A pause. Calls, Mr. Caldwell. Richard set his glass down. A bar, he said. People at bars talk. Yes, sir. This is bar talk. Probably. Probably, Richard repeated. He could hear his own voice, flat, controlled, certain, and he recognized it as the voice of a man who doesn't want to believe something and has decided that not wanting to believe it is the same as it not being true. Thank you for letting me know, Derek. Have a good night. He hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he refilled his glass and went back to the numbers. Every problem had a price. Every obstacle had a solution. Every person could eventually be moved. He believed this. Always believed this. He drank his scotch and read his projections and went to bed. And in the morning, the world he had always believed in would be waiting for him exactly as he had left it. That was what he told himself. That was what he needed to believe. Outside, in the dark, the first distant sound of engines moved across the Ohio night, like the opening note of something enormous. Well, did not hear it, but it was coming, already on its way. Margaret, in her guest room that night, did not sleep. She lay in the dark with Daniel's jacket folded on the chair beside the bed. Sarah had retrieved it from the curb and brought it inside without being asked, and she thought about 31 years of a life lived in a house that was no longer hers. About Daniel. About the night he had been voted in, come home with the jacket, and she had turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of what it represented, not danger, rebellion, but belonging. A commitment to the people in that room that was as serious as any vow. About Michael as a boy, watching his father ride out on a Saturday morning with the chapter, all face pressed onto the window. She thought about all the riders she had fed and housed and sat with through their difficult years. There was the young ones, especially the ones who arrived at the chapter carrying wounds from families that had failed them, who found in the loyalty of the brotherhood something they had never been given before. She had spent 3 decades being the person they could come to. She had never once asked for anything in return, because that was not how it worked. That had never been how it worked. You gave what you had because it was right to give it. And because though you never said this out loud, held it over anyone, never once thought of it as a transaction, the people you gave to were the kind of people who did not forget. She lay in the dark and listened to the distant sound that had begun sometime around midnight, a low, rhythmic vibration from far away that might have been thunder, might have been highway traffic, might have been her imagination. She knew it was none of those things. She closed her eyes. Careful, Daniel fell. There, she said, to the jacket, the dark, to the man who had been gone for 11 years and whose presence she still felt in rooms where she sat alone. Be careful with our boy. Then she pulled the blanket up. She waited for morning. The morning after the eviction, Caldwell woke up at 6:15, the same time he had woken up every weekday for the past 20 years. He dressed. He drank his coffee black, standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through overnight emails the way a general scans a battlefield map before the day's first engagement. The Red Valley Commons projections were still open on his tablet from the night before. He glanced at them, felt the familiar satisfaction of numbers that worked the way numbers were supposed to work. Put the tablet down. Derek's call from the night before had faded to the back of his mind by the time he finished his second cup. Their talk, he had decided. Men in a bar, talking big about connections they probably didn't have, unifying a story because that's what men in bars did. Richard had been in business long enough to know that rumors of consequence almost never were. He picked up his phone, checked his calendar, and went to work. He did not notice the 6 missed calls from his property manager, Tom Greer. He did not notice them because his phone was on silent during his morning drive, which was another rule. He kept no calls before 9. Plain thinking required clean time. He had read that in a book once and believed it completely. Read the calls until 9. He had until then. Believing everything was fine. He was wrong in a way that would take his breath away before the morning was over. Tom Greer was not a dramatic man. He had managed Richard's properties for 11 years with the same level of dependability that Richard prized above almost any other quality in the people who worked for him. Tom did not exaggerate. Tom did not panic. Tom did not call 6 times before 8 in the morning unless something had happened that fell outside the neat categories of his professional vocabulary. When Richard finally listened to the voicemails at 9:03, sitting in his office with the door closed and the city spread out below his 14th floor window, the first thing he noticed was the sound of Tom's voice. Tom sounded afraid. "Mr. Caldwell, it's Tom. I'm at the Willow Creek property. I need you to call me back as soon as you get this." The sound of wind, and somewhere behind it, there's something else, a low rumble that Tom's phone wasn't quite picking up clearly. "Call me back, please." Richard called him back. Tom answered before the first ring finished. "How many messages did I leave you?" Tom said, and his voice was controlled now, deliberately flattened, the voice of a man who has chosen to be professional about something that is making him extremely unprofessional on the inside. Richard said, "What's happening? I need you to look at something. Can you pull up the street view cameras on the Willow Creek property? Ones we installed last week for the demo survey?" Richard frowned. He turned to his desktop computer, pulled up the security management portal. The camera feed for the Willow Creek Road property, the small house that was now legally and completely his. He looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. Tom, the other end of the line, waited. "How long have they been there?" Richard finally said. "About 4 this morning," Tom said. "Best I can tell from the timestamps. With maybe a dozen. By sunrise, it was closer to 40. Last count I made was..." He stopped. Exhale. "I stopped counting at 73. On the camera feed, the street in front of the Willow Creek Road property was lined with motorcycles, parked haphazardly, lined up with a kind of deliberate precision that made the visual even more striking, row after row after row, filling both sides of the road in both directions from the property. Riders standing among them in small groups, some drinking coffee from thermoses, some talking quietly, all of them wearing the same leather patch, red and white. "Tom," Richard said carefully. "Call the police," Tom said. "An hour ago." And another long pause. Tom said. "Officer talked to the man who appears to be running things. Name of Michael Lawson. Officer came back and told me that as long as the riders stay on the public road and public property, there's nothing actionable. They're not on your property, not blocking the driveway access. They're not making threats." He paused. "But they're just standing there." Richard stared at the screen. 73 men, standing in the street in front of his property, cold of an October morning, just standing there. "Michael Lawson," Richard said. Tom was quiet for a beat too long. He's the chapter president of the Red Valley Hells Angels," Tom said. Their pause. Shorter. Harder. "He's the evicted woman's son." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Counted them without meaning to. Then he said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled and absolutely furious, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up. He sat for one more moment, looking at the camera feed, looking at the rows of motorcycles, looking at the men who had arrived in the dark and were standing now in the October morning light as if they had all the time in the world, which he was beginning to understand they did. He grabbed his coat and went downstairs. Would later say that the drive to Willow Creek Road was the longest 20 minutes of his life. He would say this not because anything happened during the drive, but because of what happened inside his own head, the sound of his own certainty, which had been the loudest and most consistent presence in his professional life for 2 decades, beginning, for the first time, to crack. He tried to marshal it back together, rehearsed what he would say. He thought about his attorneys, about the legal standing he had on that property, about the fact that a crowd of men standing in a public street was a public street crowd of men standing, nothing more, nothing less, and that the law was clear, and the law was on his side, and the law was all that mattered. He believed all of that. He tried to believe all of that. Onto Willow Creek Road and saw them, and the belief went out of him like air from a punctured tire. The camera feed had not communicated the sound. He had forgotten to account for the sound. Even with the engines off, and they were all off, all 70-something of them, every bike silent, and still there was a sound. Not the sound of machinery, the sound of people. That many people gathered and waiting and wearing their collective identity like a second skin, create a vibration that is less about noise and more about mass, presence, about weight. It is the sound that crowds have always made when they gather around something that matters to them, a sound that is barely audible and absolutely unmistakable. Richard pulled to the curb and got out of his car. The nearest riders glanced at him. They did not move. They did not speak. They looked at him with the particular expression of people who have already decided what they think of you and are waiting to see if you will change their minds. He straightened his jacket and walked toward the man he assumed was in charge, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s standing near the property line with a coffee cup in his hand, looking quietly to two other riders. Michael Lawson looked up when Richard approached. He looked at Richard the way Richard had looked at his mother's house, taking in the full picture before deciding which part of it to address first. Well, Michael said. Richard stopped 3 feet away. People are on a public road. I've already checked. But trespassing, you know that. I do, Michael said. I'll ask you directly. What do you want? Michael took a slow sip of coffee. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of a man who has thought very carefully about what he is going to say and is taking the time to make sure he says it right. My mother lived in that house for 31 years, he said. Mother died in that house. She asked you for 2 more weeks. You said no. Then you went to her home, took my father's patch off the chair where she kept it. You dropped it in the mud. Richard began to speak. Raised one hand, not aggressive, not threatening, but just stop. And Richard stopped, which surprised him more than anything that had happened that morning, because Richard Caldwell did not stop for people who raised their hands at him. Not finished, Michael said evenly. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to do anything illegal. My people are standing on a public road, and we're going to keep standing here. But I want you to understand something, Caldwell, because I don't think you understood it yesterday. He looked at Richard directly. A man looks at another man when the words he is about to say are true, and he knows they are true, and he needs the other man to know it too. But my mother is not a tenant. She is not a number on a spreadsheet. She is a woman who has spent 30 years of her life giving to people who had nothing. Riders who were injured and had no one to sit with them. Kids who aged out of foster care and had nowhere to go. Some who lost their way and needed someone to tell them they still mattered. He paused. She never asked for anything in return. Not once. And when you showed up at her door yesterday, you didn't see any of that. An obstacle. The word landed the way Michael intended it to land. Richard said nothing. So now we're here, Michael said. We're going to keep being here until this is resolved. Resolved how? Richard said, and his voice was flatter than he meant it to be. That's up to you, Michael said. And he turned back to his coffee. Richard stood for a moment longer. He looked at the rows of motorcycles. He looked at the men standing among them. He looked at Michael's back. Then he got in his car and drove away. As lawyers, he needed to think. He needed to find the price of this particular problem. Because every problem had a price, didn't it? The question followed him all the way back to his office, and it felt different from the questions he was used to asking. Smaller somehow, less certain, like something that had always been solid had started, in its foundation, to shift. He pushed the feeling down. His lawyer, a man named Gerald Fowles, who had been handling Richard's legal affairs for 15 years, and who had seen Richard through disputes that were considerably messier than 70 men standing on a public road. It's a stunt, Gerald said, when Richard had finished explaining. Public pressure campaign. Perfectly legal on their end, as you've already established, and it's going to generate media attention if you're not careful. What kind of media attention? The kind that hurts. Gerald's voice was clipped, professional, but Richard could hear something underneath it, a careful distance that Gerald sometimes put between himself and Richard's decisions when he thought Richard had made one he wouldn't have advised. elderly disabled woman, the widow of a community figure. From a home she lived in for 30 years, a motorcycle club of how many, 70-something at last count, standing in solidarity. A pause. Third, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. The jacket, silence. Derek mentioned it in the incident report he filed with us for liability purposes, Gerald said. Described what happened. The jacket. What you said. Richard did not speak. Sir, did you throw the jacket? I dropped it. On the ground. It was a leather jacket. Oh, it's not like It was her late husband's club patch, Gerald said. And his voice for just a moment stopped being a lawyer's voice and became a person's voice. Dropped a dead man's patch in the mud and told his widow, the biker life means nothing. The words got back to him in Gerald's deliberate legal cadence, a bit different from how they had sounded inside Richard's own head when he'd said them. Different and considerably worse. What's your advice, Richard said. My advice, Gerald said carefully, is that this is not a legal problem. Not primarily. This is a people problem. And people problems don't get solved with paperwork. He let that sit. Then he said, I think you need to go talk to her. Richard said nothing. Others? Not through an intermediary, not through a statement. You, in person, you need to go talk to Margaret Lawson. Richard ended the call. He sat in his office for a long time after that, looking at nothing in particular. In the 48 hours since he had walked up Margaret's driveway with his manila folder and his certainty, something had been shifting in him, not dramatically, not the way things shift in movies, with a sudden revelation and a changed heart, more slowly than that, more uncomfortably, the way a stone shifts in water gradually, announcement until the whole shape of the riverbed is different. But coming back to one moment, not the jacket, Michael's words that morning, not the sight of 70 men lined up on a public road. He kept coming back to Margaret's question, the one she had asked before everything went wrong. There's standing in the doorway of her home with her steady, unfrightened eyes. Have you ever lost something that couldn't be replaced? He had dismissed it. He had moved past it. He had treated it as the kind of question desperate people ask when they're trying to appeal to an emotion they hope exists in the person across from them. But sitting alone in his office, he found himself actually trying to answer it. And he discovered, uncomfortably and with a clarity he was not prepared for, that he could not think of a single thing he had lost that money couldn't replace. I was at that for a while. It was not a comfortable place to sit. Outside the office, his assistant knocked on the door. Well, there's a reporter from the Red Valley Courier on line 2. She's asking about the eviction on Willow Creek Road. Richard closed his eyes. I'll call back, he said. He would not call back. He needed the time to appear normal. He needed the world to believe, for a few more hours, that he had this under control. He picked up his phone and pulled up a contact he hadn't used in several years. A woman named Patricia Odom, a community liaison consultant he had hired once when a development project in the northern part of the county had generated neighborhood resistance. Patricia was good at exactly one thing. She understood how people felt, and she knew how to translate that understanding into language that built bridges instead of walls. He called her methods irritatingly soft. He called her anyway. Patricia, he said when she answered. I have a situation I need your help with. Tell me what happened, she said. He told her. She listened all the way through, without interrupting her, which was something Richard almost never experienced in his professional life. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Did she cry? Patricia asked. Margaret Lawson, when you were at the house. Did she cry? No, Richard said. And something about the answer felt important in a way he couldn't articulate. That concerns me more than if she had, Patricia said. Because people who cry are afraid. People who don't cry when they have every reason to, they're not afraid at all. She paused. People who aren't afraid of you are the people who know something you don't. The line was quiet. Come to your office this afternoon, Patricia said. Richard, and I'm saying this as a professional who's trying to help you, whatever you're planning to do, you need to understand something first. What's that? You didn't just evict a woman, Patricia said. You humiliated a mother in front of her home. And the person she's connected to, the community she belongs to, they measure everything by loyalty. Always have. It's not a strategy for them. It's who they are. She let that land. Sure. You can't buy your way out of this one, she said. To earn your way out. Richard stared at the wall. I'll see you at 2, he said. He hung up. He thought about loyalty, about what it really meant to the kind of people who had stood in the cold since 4 in the morning, being asked to, without payment, without anything in it for them, except the chance to stand next to the person they felt all obligated to stand next to. About who in his own life would do that for a long time. The list he came up with was short, better than he expected. He pushed back from his desk and walked to the window and looked at the city he had built pieces of, whose skyline contained the fingerprints of his ambition at a dozen different points, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely small. Not humiliated, not angry, just small. Like a man who has been walking in a room he thought was very large and has just realized he has been going in circles. On Willow Creek Road, the number had reached 100 by the time afternoon came. Sarah Mitchell, who had not left Margaret's side all day, watched them arrive through the front window. She had been keeping a quiet count, marking them in her head the way you count things that matter. Counting when she ran out of clear sight lines. She turned to Margaret, who was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold. And she said, Michael's people are out there. I know, Margaret said. There are a lot of them. Margaret wrapped both hands around her cold cup. Always a lot of them, she said. I never needed them all at once before. Are you scared? Margaret thought about it honestly. The way she approached most questions, without the softening agents people usually apply to the truth when they don't like its shape. I'm sad, she finally said, not scared, sad. Because that man missed, well, I don't think he's a monster. I think he's just someone who forgot that the people in front of him are real. She paused. It makes me sad, because I've met a lot of people in my life who forgot that, and it never ended well for them. Sarah looked at her. Goody corns. You feel sorry for him, she said, and it was not quite a question. Oh, Margaret said. She looked down at her tea. Is that strange? Sarah thought about the man who had arrived with his folder and his certainty and his 2 big contractors. The way he had not looked at Margaret's face when he spoke, the jacket and the mud and the 4 words that had set everything in motion. She said, I think that's exactly who you are. Margaret smiled, and a little tired. The smile of a woman who has made her peace with being who she is. That cost her something. Yet Daniel used to say she stopped. Heard again. He used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they treat people they're afraid of. They treat people they think can't hurt them. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the sound of engines arriving, not running, their bikes pulling in, finding places along the street, pressed against the window like a tide. That test, Sarah said softly. He did, Margaret agreed. But tests aren't the end of the story. She looked up. For anyone, across town, Richard Caldwell, sitting in a room with Patricia Odom, and he was doing something he had not done voluntarily in 22 years of business. He was listening, really listening, not waiting for his turn to speak, cataloging the other person's argument so he could dismantle it when they finished, not looking for the price, just listening. Patricia had arrived at 2 with a yellow legal pad and a directness that matched his own, and she had said, at the very beginning of the meeting, there she even sat down, I'm going to tell you some things that are going to be hard to hear. If you want me to stop at any point, tell me. But if you stop me, I can't help you. He had said he wouldn't stop her. Almost stopped her twice. She told him about Daniel Lawson, the founding of the Red Valley chapter, about the history of a man who had built his reputation on the same principle that Richard had spent his career ignoring, that power was not the same as respect, and that the former, without the latter, was a house built on sand. About Margaret, about the years after Daniel's accident, the chapter's loyalty to the woman who had become its center of gravity, the trike they had built so she could keep riding after she lost mobility, about the young people she had helped, about the quiet persistent work of a woman who believed that care was not something you offered when it was convenient. She gave her whole life to those people, Patricia said. Not because she wanted something from them, not because she was building an empire, because she genuinely believed that the point of having something time, space in your home was to share it. She looked at Richard, and you walked into that life and told her it was worth nothing. The room was very still. I didn't say she was worth nothing, Richard said. You picked up her dead husband's jacket, Patricia said, and you dropped it in the mud and told her that life meant nothing. He had no answer for that. There wasn't one. Patricia set down her legal pad. Here's what I think needs to happen, she said. And I want to be clear, this isn't a strategy. This isn't a PR move. This isn't about managing the story. What's actually right. Can you hold those two things separately? Tell me, he said. Erbakel, you need to make this right with Margaret, not with money. First with words, spoken in person to her face, with actions that correct what was done. And then, and only then, you think about the business side of this. Richard was quiet. There may not be a way to keep the property, Patricia said. I don't know. That's a legal question, but I know this. If you try to solve this by treating it as a property dispute, you will lose things that are worth more than any piece of real estate. Like what? He said. She looked at him steadily. Your ability to do business in this town, she said. Employees comfort working for you. Your wife, looking at you the same way at the dinner table. She paused. And maybe something you haven't thought about yet. The ability to look at what you do every day and feel like a good person. The silence that followed was the longest one of the meeting. Richard looked at the table. Patricia waited. He looked up. Up the meeting, he said. Patricia allowed herself a single exhale. I'll call Sarah Mitchell, she said. I'll know how to reach Margaret. She picked up her phone. Richard sat in his chair, in his glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, out at the city, and looked out at the city. He was thinking about the question Margaret had asked him. He was thinking about whether he had ever lost something that couldn't be replaced. He was beginning to understand for the first time in his life that he had been building his empire in a way that made it very easy to replace everything. And that this, which he had always thought of as strength, it might be the loneliest kind of poverty there was. Down the hall, Patricia was already talking to someone on the phone. On Willow Creek Road, 100 motorcycles sat in a row. And Margaret Lawson, in Sarah's kitchen, held a cup of tea in both hands. And waited. Patricia made the call to Sarah Mitchell at 3:47 in the afternoon. Sarah answered on the first ring, which told Patricia everything she needed to know about how alert that household had been all day. This is Patricia Odom, she said. I'm a consultant working with Richard Caldwell. I want to be clear from the start. I'm not calling to threaten anything or defend what happened. Because Mr. Caldwell would like to meet with Margaret. No lawyers, no paperwork, no agenda except to talk. There was a silence on Sarah's end that lasted long enough to feel deliberate. Sarah said. Patricia heard footsteps, a door, bold voices Sarah's and another woman's, lower, then more silence. Then Sarah came back. She says she'll meet him, Sarah said, but not at her house, the one he took from her, and not at his office. Name the place, Patricia said. There pause. The parking lot of Red Valley Community Church on Birch Street, Sarah said. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. She wants Michael there. Patricia wrote it down. Fine. Will Michael? Michael will be there, Sarah said, with a flatness that made the sentence sound less like a reassurance and more like a warning. And Patricia? Yes. Tell Mr. Caldwell to come ready to listen. To listen first. Patricia looked across the conference table at Richard, who was watching her face for information. I'll tell him, she said. She hung up. She set her phone on the table. Tomorrow morning, she told Richard. 8 o'clock, community church parking lot on Birch Street. She wants her son there. Richard nodded. She wants you to listen, Patricia added. Will you say anything? She wants you to listen. He nodded again. Lower this time. I can do that. Patricia studied him for a moment, the way you study a person when you're trying to determine whether they mean what they're saying, or whether they simply want to believe they mean it, which is a different thing entirely. Richard, she said, whatever you were planning to say tomorrow, whatever you've rehearsed, whatever case you were going to make, I need you to leave all of it in this room tonight. He looked at her. A negotiation, Patricia said. She's a person. So you need to walk in there as a person. A businessman, not a developer, a person. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, I'm not sure I know how to do that. It was the most honest thing he had said all day, possibly all year. Patricia picked up her legal pad. Then you better spend tonight figuring it out. She left him in the conference room with the city spread out below him and the light going amber through the windows and the weight of a day he had not expected pressing down on everything. He sat there until dark. He sat there thinking about all the mornings he had driven to other people's houses with folders and certainty and two men in gray polos, peeping to counting. He sat there trying to count them. And when he realized he could not, when he realized the number was too high to reconstruct from memory, something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with business. About Diane, about whether he would tell her tonight, whether she would be surprised. He thought about her face and realized with a slow and uncomfortable clarity that she would not be surprised at all. Of home, he told her. She listened without interrupting, which was what she always did, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Yes. They were sitting at the kitchen table. The dinner she had made was still between them, half eaten and going cold. Richard, she said. I know. No, she shook her head. Think you do? Not yet. She looked at him across the table with the eyes of a woman who has loved someone for a long time and has learned to separate who they are from who they could be. That jacket, that was someone's whole life in leather. And you picked it up and threw it in the mud like it was trash. I dropped it, he said. Reflexively, she looked at him. He stopped. You dropped it, she repeated, but completely without comfort. Okay. He looked at the table. Tomorrow, she said, go and actually listen. Not the way you listen in meetings, where you're building your counter-argument while the other person is still talking. Actually listen. She reached across and put her hand on his arm. You're a good person, Richard. You've gotten very practiced at not seeing people. I say that knowing I should have said it a long time ago. He looked up at her. Tell me you should have said something sooner, he said. I should have, she said simply. That's on both of us. He covered her hand with his, like that for a while. Outside somewhere across town, October night was cold, and the street on Willow Creek Road was still lined with motorcycles. The Hells Angels did not leave when the sun went down. They had set up a rotation, some riders heading to nearby homes to sleep. There's taking shifts, keeping the presence continuous and visible and absolutely undeniable. Michael had organized it the way he organized everything, quietly, efficiently, with a precision that came from years of running a chapter that understood the weight of its own commitments. He was standing with Cannon near the end of the block when his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Here, she's meeting him tomorrow, 8 a.m. church parking lot. Here, you'd be there. He read it twice. Then he typed back, I'll be there. He looked at Cannon. She's meeting him tomorrow. Cannon sipped his coffee. How's she doing? You know, Mom, Michael said. That's why I'm asking. Michael thought about the conversation he'd had with her that afternoon when he'd stopped by Sarah's to check on her. She had been at the kitchen table with her hands around that cold cup of tea, and she had looked up when he walked in with the same steadiness she had carried through all of it, the same steadiness she had carried through his father's accident, her own medical decline, through every hard thing that the years had brought. She had looked at him and said, sit down, baby. He had sat. Tell me how you're doing, she said. He had almost laughed. Remember, she was the one who had been evicted from her home 12 hours ago, and she was asking how he was doing. I'm fine, Mom. You're angry. Yes, that's okay. I need you to do something for me. Anything. Don't let the anger run the show tomorrow. Whatever happens, don't let it run the show. He had looked at her for a moment. Ever tell you how hard that is? And she had smiled, that tired, completely genuine smile, and said every single day, now, I'm standing on Willow Creek Road in the dark with Cannon beside him. Michael turned that conversation over in his mind. About his father, who had been the steadiest man he'd ever known, not because Daniel Lawson was without anger, because he had learned over decades to be bigger than it. "Gonna be fine," Michael told Cannon. "She's always fine. That's what worries me sometimes." Cannon looked at him. "Young people carry things in silence until they can't," Michael said. "There," and then nobody knows how heavy it was. Cannon was quiet for a moment. "That your dad said something like that once." "I know," Michael said. "She told me." The night passed the way difficult nights pass slowly. The dark giving way to gray, giving way to the thin light of an October morning that had no interest in being gentle. Caldwell was awake before his alarm. He lay in the dark for a few minutes, aware of Diane breathing beside him, aware of the quiet of the house, aware of something sitting in the center of his chest that he could not quite name. It was not fear, exactly. It was the feeling of a man walking towards something he cannot control, knowing it and going anyway. He dressed simply. No jacket, no tie, jeans and a plain button-down, which was not a costume or a strategy, or at least he was trying not to let it be. He was trying to just be a person getting dressed to go talk to another person. He drove to the church on Birch Street with the radio off. He arrived at 7:52, which meant he was there before everyone else, which was both a habit and this morning a kind of penance. He wanted to be the one waiting for once. He wanted to be in the position of having to stand and let someone else arrive. Mitchell's car pulled into the lot at 7:58. Margaret's motorized wheelchair came down the ramp from the side door. A moment later, and Margaret guided herself across the lot with the practiced ease of someone who has long since made peace with the logistics of her body. Arrived 30 seconds behind his mother. He had Cannon with him. The rioters, not a show of force. Richard understood. Witnesses. People who cared about Margaret enough to be present. Richard stood beside his car and did not move forward. He let them come to him or not, as they chose. Margaret stopped her wheelchair about 5 feet from him. She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the first time since the morning at the house that they had seen each other's faces. Richard was struck again by what he had noticed the first time and tried to dismiss the steadiness in her eyes. Complete absence of performance. She was not performing grief for him, not performing dignity, not performing anything. She was simply there, being exactly who she was, and it was more disarming than anything he had prepared for. Earl stood slightly behind and to her left. He did not speak. He looked at Richard with an expression that was not threatening and not warm, and was simply watchful, the expression of a man who has promised himself he will hear the next few minutes out before he decides what they mean. Richard opened his mouth, and then he remembered Patricia's voice, "Whatever you've rehearsed in that room." He closed his mouth again. He breathed. He started over. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Claire, Paul, I owe you an apology. I want to give you one, but I don't want to give you the version I've been working on in my head, because I think that version is more about making me feel better than it is about actually telling you the truth." A beat of silence. Margaret waited. "So let me try to say the real thing." He looked at her. "Walked into your home yesterday like it was a unit on a spreadsheet. I spoke to you like you were an obstacle between me and something I wanted. I went into your bedroom without your permission. I picked up something that meant everything to you." He stopped, pushed past it. "I dropped it in the mud. I said something about your husband's life that I have no right to say about any man's life, let alone a man I've never met." He paused. "I don't know how to make that right," he said. "Yours is. I don't think there's a version of sorry that covers it. I am sorry. Not because you have 100 motorcycles on my street, though you do, but because what I did was wrong. It was wrong before the motorcycles got there. It was wrong the second I decided you were a problem to be solved instead of a person to be heard." He stopped. The parking lot was very quiet. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, not with warmth yet, and not with hostility, with the steady, real self-tension of someone who is weighing what they've heard against what they know about people. In her case, was a great deal. Then she said, "That's more than I expected from you." "I know," he said. "Enough," she said. "I know that too." She nodded. Her husband used to say that the first step to doing right is knowing you did wrong. Or not what you're going to lose if you don't fix it. That people will think of you just knowing it was wrong. She held his eyes. But do you actually know that? Or do you know it because 100 motorcycles made it impossible to pretend otherwise? The question landed exactly where it was meant to land. Richard stood with it. He stood with it honestly, which was harder than he expected, as the honest answer required him to look at the sequence of his own feelings over the past 24 hours and identify the point at which his regret had become real versus the point at which it had merely become useful. "Tough," he said. "At first it was the motorcycles. I'm not going to lie to you about that." Margaret's eyes did not change. "Sitting with it last night," he stopped. "My wife said something to me that I've gotten practiced at not seeing people. And she's right. And I think yesterday was the first time the cost of that showed up in a way I couldn't minimize or move past. I don't know if that's the same as knowing it was wrong. That's close to the truth as I can get right now." It was the most unguarded thing he had said in years. Behind his mother shifted his weight. His expression changed not by much, barely perceptible, but Richard caught it. Something moved in the younger man's face that had not been there before. Forgiveness. Not yet. Something earlier than that. First faint recognition that the person in front of him might actually be salvageable. Margaret said, "What happens to my house?" Richard had been waiting for this. He had spent the night thinking about it. He had an answer that was not the answer his business brain would have given him 3 days ago. Asked him something to arrive at it, and he was going to give it to her anyway. "Having to work with my attorneys to reverse the acquisition," he said. "Won't pretend it's simple. Investors involved, and timelines and obligations. I'm going to make it happen. And in the meantime, whatever repairs the house needs, because it sat empty, and I'm responsible for what happened during that time. I'm covering all of it." Michael said, very quietly, from behind his mother, "Why?" Richard looked at him. "It's her home." The 3 words sat there. Michael studied him. "I'm not asking for your trust," Richard said, looking between mother and son. "I understand I haven't earned that. I'm asking for the chance to do the thing that should have been done from the beginning." Margaret was quiet. There, she turned her wheelchair slightly not away from Richard, to the side, in the way someone turns when they need a moment to think without their face being red. Looked at the sky. It was the pale, clean blue of an October morning after a cold night, with long light coming sideways and sharp, the kind of light that makes everything look more defined than usual. Edges clearer, distances shorter. Then she turned back. "I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Not to make you feel better, and not to punish you, but because it's true, and I think you need to hear it." He waited. "My husband spent 20 years protecting people that the rest of the world had decided didn't matter. Addicts, kids from broken homes, men who made mistakes and couldn't find a way back. Oh, people the man like you would have looked at and seen a liability." She paused. However, he didn't do it because he was a saint. He did it because he understood something very simple. The measure of your life is not what you built. It's who you built it with, and who was still there when the building got hard. She looked at him steadily. "The con monitors. You've built a lot," she said. "I can see that. But I wonder if you've looked around lately at who's still there." The question went into him differently from any of the other words that morning. He did not have an answer for it. He was not sure he could find one if he tried. But he felt it land. He felt it settle into a place that had been empty for a long time. And he understood. In the way you understand certain things, only when they are said to you at exactly the right moment by exactly the right person, that this was something he was going to be living with for a while. "Thank you," he said, "for saying that." Margaret nodded. Then something happened that Richard Caldwell had not remotely anticipated. Margaret Lawson turned her wheelchair toward her son and said, "Go get everyone." Michael looked at her. "Go get everyone," she said again. And there was something in her voice that was not a command and not a request, but something between the two, the tone of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and needs the people around her to trust that. Michael looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he looked at Richard. Then he took out his phone. He made one call. He said 4 words, "Come up." Now Richard heard it before he understood what it was. A sound from the direction of Willow Creek Road, which was 3 blocks from the church parking lot, that was not loud at first. A roar that television associates with motorcycles, something lower and more complex. The combined idle of 100 engines, warming up together, rolling slowly through the quiet streets of the neighborhood in the thin October morning. Getting closer, Richard turned to look at the entrance of the church parking lot. His bike came around the corner, then another, 5 more, then they kept coming. Not fast, not aggressive. They're moving with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement that measured the entrance of people who are not arriving to scare anyone but to be seen, to be counted, to make it absolutely clear that they are present and that their presence means something. They filled the parking lot without being directed, arranged themselves in a loose arc around the space where Richard and Margaret and Michael stood, and one by one the engines cut off, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of 100 people who had driven through the night to stand next to one woman. Margaret watched them come, and for the first time since the morning at her house, she had sat in her doorway and watched strangers box up 31 years of her life. For the first time in 2 days, her eyes filled with grief, with something harder to name. The specific emotion of a person who has given everything they had for decades without expectation of return is watching the return arrive anyway. In a parking lot at 8 in the morning, there and exhaust and the low rumble of American iron. Paul came to stand beside her. He put his hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. Richard watched all of it. He watched it with the particular attention of a man who is seeing something he cannot categorize, something that does not fit in any of the boxes he has spent his professional life building to organize the world. 100 people arranged themselves around one woman, not because they were asked, but because they wanted to. And he felt the strangeness of that, the sheer uncommon human strangeness of it, move through him like a current. About what Margaret had said. The measure of your life is not what you built. It's who you built it with. He thought about the 14-floor office, the $63 million, the Red Valley Commons projections sitting on his desktop with their clean numbers and their clean lines and their complete absence of any human face. About who would fill a parking lot for him. He had his answer from the night before, and it had not gotten longer overnight. I don't approach Richard then. Just walked up to him, unhurried, with the particular ease of a man who has been around long enough to know that moments like this one are rare and should be handled with care. You know who she is now, Cannon said. Not accusatory, not triumphant, just a statement of fact from a man who had known Margaret Lawson for 30 years. I'm starting to, Richard said. Cannon looked at him for a moment. I'm trying to forgive you, he said, because that's who she is. But I need you to understand something. Go ahead. Our people have long memories, Cannon said. They're grudges for character. We're going to watch what you do from here. What you say, what you do, and the way we see it will spread, he paused. Work for you or against you. Depends entirely on you. Richard held his gaze. Understand. Good, Cannon said, and walked back to the others. What happened next was not what Richard expected. And perhaps that was the most important thing about it, that it could not have been engineered or anticipated or controlled, which meant it was real. Margaret turned her wheelchair toward the assembled crowd of riders and raised her voice not loudly, clearly in the carrying way of a woman who had spent decades making herself heard in rooms that weren't built for her. I thank every person who came, she said. You have to come. Nobody told you to. You came because Daniel built something worth coming for, kept it alive after he was gone. And I am so grateful. Her voice caught just for a second, and she let it catch, which was its own kind of courage. I want you to hear me when I say this. We're not here for revenge. We're not here to make anyone afraid. We're here because the truth needed witnesses. Now it has them. She paused. This man, she gestured toward Richard, looking at him, is going to make things right. I'm going to let him, because Daniel always said that a person who does wrong and then does right has traveled a harder road than a person who never did wrong at all. I believe that. I've always believed that. She turned her chair back toward Richard. She looked at him directly. Don't make me regret it, she said. It was not a threat. It was something far more serious than a threat. That's trust. The fragile, earned, real kind, the kind that costs the person offering it something genuine. Well, looked at Margaret Lawson in the middle of a church parking lot, surrounded by 100 people who loved her, and felt time in 2 days genuinely small. But this time, all felt different. This time, small felt like the beginning of something. You won't, he said. One of the riders near the back started his engine. At first, a low rolling note in the October air. Then another joined it. Then another. Not all at once sequentially, each one added to the one before, building the sound the way you build something that is meant to last. By the time all 100 engines were running, the sound was not noise anymore. It was something closer to music. Margaret Lawson sat in her wheelchair in the middle of that sound and closed her eyes, and the expression on her face was not peace exactly, not happiness exactly, but something that contained both of those things and something else, too, the particular feeling of a person who has walked a very long road and arrived, finally at a place that was worth all of it. Michael watched his mother's face, and he felt his father's absence so sharply in that moment that it almost felt like presence, like Daniel was there in the parking lot with them, somewhere in the sound, somewhere in the October light, watching the thing he built, still standing after all of it. Herbert Caldwell stood at the edge of all of it. He was not part of it, but he was watching. That was where it started, not with an apology, with a check, not with a legal reversal, but with a man standing at the edge of something real and finally, the first time in a very long time, actually seeing it. The engines kept running. The morning light went long and gold across the parking lot. Richard Caldwell made himself a promise, quietly and without audience, that he was going to have to start from the beginning, not the beginning of his business, the beginning of something harder and more necessary than anything he had ever built, of understanding what buildings were actually for. Miss Richard Caldwell made to himself in that parking lot was easy to keep for exactly 48 hours. He went back to his office. He called Gerald. He told him to begin the process of reversing the Willow Creek Road acquisition. And he said it in the tone of a man who had made a decision, a man who was opening a negotiation, which was a tone Gerald had rarely heard from him before, which the lawyer noted without comment. He called his property manager, Tom, and told him to arrange access to the house for a contractor assessment. He told Tom that whatever the repairs cost, they came out of his personal account at the company budget. Tom wrote that down without asking why, because Tom was smart enough to understand that some instructions did not require explanation. He drafted a public statement with Patricia. It was short, plain, and contained no legal hedging, which meant his PR team read it 3 times, looking for the hidden protection they assumed must be somewhere inside it. They couldn't find it. They sent it back with suggestions for softening language. Richard sent it out as he had written it. The statement said, I made a serious error in judgment in my handling of the eviction at Willow Creek Road. I treated a resident without the dignity she deserved. I am working to correct what was done, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. 12 words in that last sentence. He had counted them. The response was immediate and, in some ways, more than he had anticipated. Local media covered the story. The Red Valley Courier ran it on the front page of their online edition within 3 hours of the statement going out. Then a regional news outlet picked it up. Then a national outlet with a human interest wire saw the detail about the Hells Angels and ran a version of the stories that spread the way only certain kinds of stories spread, the kind that touch something people have been carrying quietly and hadn't found words for yet. At the end of that second day, Richard's statement had been shared 40,000 times. He did not check his phone. He was too busy making phone calls that mattered more. This call was to the investors behind Red Valley Commons, the Chicago group that had flown in 2 days ago and celebrated with him over dinner about the acquisition of the final property. It lasted 40 minutes. It was the most uncomfortable professional conversation of Richard's career, which was saying something. The investors were not pleased. They used words like liability and optics and contractual obligation in the particular way that people use those words when they mean we are not happy, and we want you to understand the weight of our displeasure. Richard listened to all of it. Then he said, I understand your concerns. I'm asking you to give me 30 days to restructure the south end of the Commons plan to exclude the Willow Creek property. That corner differently. I have 2 alternative parcels that have been sitting in our acquisition pipeline for 6 months. Silence on the line. 30 days. The lead investor, a man named Hartwell, 30 days. Another silence. You understand this affects the timeline? Yes, and the south corner value projection. Yes, and you're willing to absorb that personally? Yes, Richard said. The line was quiet for a long time. Then Hartwell said, a voice that was not warm, but was marginally less cold than before. Done something pretty significant, Caldwell. I did, Richard said. Up and stared at his desk for a moment. He had just absorbed what his financial team would calculate to be a potential loss of approximately $1.2 million in project value across timeline, delays, and restructured projections. He had done it in less than 60 seconds of conversation. He waited for the panic. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and far more unexpected, a feeling he could not immediately name, lived somewhere between relief and resolve. The feeling of a man who has been carrying something at an angle for so long that he forgot what it felt like to stand straight and has just, for the first time in a very long time, stood up. He picked up the phone again. He called the contractor. It was the 48 hours in which the promise was easy. The 49th hour arrived, and everything he thought he understood about what he was doing was turned upside down by a phone call he didn't expect from a person he had never met. Her name was Joanna Wyatt. She was a 63-year-old woman who lived in Canton, Ohio, and she had read the story in the regional news, the way millions of people read stories about other people's lives, with the particular attention of someone who recognizes something true because it matches something they already know. Richard's office directly. His assistant put her through because she gave her name clearly and said she had information relevant to the Willow Creek Road situation. Well, she said when he picked up. You don't know me. My name is Joanna Wyatt. 7 years ago, your company evicted me from a property on the east side of Red Valley. Richard was very still. He had been there for 9 years, she said. I had a small sewing business out of the back room. Nothing fancy. I made alterations, some custom work, 3 part-time women employed. When your company took the property, I closed the business. I couldn't find comparable space at a price I could afford. Richard said nothing. I'm not calling to threaten you, Anna said, with a directness that reminded him uncomfortably of Margaret. I'm calling because I read your statement. I want to know if you meant it. I meant it, he said. Then I have something to tell you, she said, and I think you need to hear it, she told him. What Anna described was not dramatically different from what had happened to Margaret, the property tax mechanism, acquisition, the paperwork and the process and the efficiency with which a life was reorganized around someone else's priority. And I had not had a son who was president of a motorcycle chapter. She had not had 100 people who showed up at dawn. I packed her sewing machines and her bolts of fabric and her 3 part-time employees on, and she had never told anyone. I stayed quiet, she said. I thought no one would care because the paperwork was correct and the process was legal, and I understood that I didn't have the tools to fight it. A pause. I want you to know, and I'm saying this not to hurt you, but because you asked for accountability, you didn't just take a building from me. You took the thing I built my life around, and I never recovered it. I'm 63 years old, and I'm working part-time at a fabric store, and I'm fine. I want you to know I'm fine, but I am not where I would have been. The line was quiet. How many of us are there? She asked. Richard closed his eyes. About his properties, his 22 years of acquisitions, spreadsheets with their tidy numbers. He thought about all the Joanna Wyatts he had never pictured. No, he said, but I'm going to find out. He hung up. He sat for a long time. Then he pressed the intercom button on his desk phone and said, Me, Patricia Odom. Patricia arrived within the hour. She came in, sat down, and read his face before he said a word. It happened, she said. He told her about Joanna Wyatt. Patricia listened with the same uninterrupted attention she always gave. And when he finished, she was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, not so short that it felt dismissive, not so long that it felt theatrical. Then she said, The only one, I know. You know how many properties your company has acquired in this county in the last 10 years? 43. And how many of those involved residential or small business displacement? He didn't answer. Here's Richard, I don't have that number in my head, he said. You can get it. Yes, then get it. She looked at him steadily. And when you have, you're going to have to decide what you actually believe. It's one thing to make it right with Margaret Lawson because 100 motorcycles showed up. It's a different thing to look at 43 properties and ask the same question about every one of them without anyone making you. The distinction landed exactly where she intended it. He knew what she was saying. He had been circling it since Joanna's call, the easy version of redemption, the version that made a good story and let a man return to his life, mostly unchanged, required only Margaret. Hire the apology. Because the reversal, public statement, contractor, visible, documented, resolved. The harder version, the one that would cost something real, and that would require him to look at his entire professional history with new eyes, required Joanna. Tired asking the question she had asked and actually sitting with the answer. How many of us are there? I need a week, he said. God, to pull the full acquisition history, every residential and small business displacement in the last 10 years. Addresses, names, circumstances. He looked at Patricia. Can you help me build a process for reaching out? Patricia looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. But I want to ask you something first. Go ahead. Why are you doing this? She said. I want the real answer, not the one that sounds good. Because if the real answer is still mostly about your reputation or your business relationships, the process you're asking me to build will feel like a PR exercise to the people you contact, and they will know it, and it will do more harm than staying quiet. He sat with the question. He sat with it the way he had sat with Margaret's question. The morning after the eviction, honestly, the softening agents, looking at the actual shape of his own motivation. I think, he said slowly, that I've been very good at a certain kind of building. Buildings that you can see. Buildings that generate returns. Things that last. He stopped. And I think I've been not just negligent, that's not the right word. I think I've been actively refusing to see that every building I put up had something behind it, something that was there before I was. And I decided it didn't matter because the numbers said it didn't matter. And I trusted the numbers more than I trusted the people. He looked at her. I think the answer is that Joanna Wyatt called me from Canton and asked how many of her there are. I couldn't answer her. And I'm 51 years old, and I've never in my life not been able to answer a question about my own business. That scared me more than the motorcycles did. Patricia held his gaze. The real answer, she said. Yes. She picked up her legal pad. Then let's build the process, she said. While Richard was in his office with Patricia, filling acquisition files and trying to account for the full cost of his efficiency, Lawson was sitting in his mother's house on Willow Creek Road. House was back. Technically, the formal legal reversal was still in process. Gerald Fowles had warned that clean documentation would take several weeks, but Richard had called Michael directly 2 days after the parking lot meeting and said, simply the locks are coming off today. Her keys will be on the porch by noon. And Margaret had gone home that afternoon. Sarah had driven her, or had met them there. And Margaret had gone through every room slowly, in her wheelchair, without speaking. Michael had followed at a distance, the way you follow someone who needs to be witnessed, but not accompanied, present enough to be felt, or enough back to give them the space the moment required. She went into the bedroom last. Daniel's jacket was in Michael's hands. Their cotters. He had been carrying it since Sarah's house because Margaret had asked him to. She'd said she didn't want to hold it until she was home, because the holding of it meant something that she wasn't ready to feel in someone else's space. She stopped in the middle of the bedroom. She held out her hand, gave her the jacket. She held it in her lap for a moment. Then she leaned forward and placed it very carefully in the chair beside the dresser, exactly where it had been. The same fold. She sat back. She looked at it. She said very quietly, to Daniel or to the room, or to the 11 years of his absence that had never fully left that chair. Okay, we're home. Michael stood in the doorway. He didn't trust his voice, so he said nothing. That was the evening that Tom Greer arrived with a crew to assess the repairs. He came with a clipboard and a careful professionalism that had clearly been briefed. He was respectful. He was efficient. He asked Margaret's permission before going into each room. And he kept his clipboard turned so she couldn't see the running total he was building. When he was done, he came to the living room where Margaret was sitting and said, a full crew here Monday morning. Should take about a week and a half. We're going to make it right, Mrs. Us and Margaret looked at him. How much is all this costing, Mr. Well, Tom paused. He asked me not to say, he said. He said the amount wasn't relevant. He said you'd probably tell him it was too much, and he didn't want to argue about it. Something moved across Margaret's face. Not quite amusement. Something more complicated than that, the expression of a person encountering a version of the man who wronged them that does not match the version they have been holding in their mind. It's like something someone told him to say, she said, almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. I think it might be. Is it a lot? It's yes. It's a fair amount. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. Tell him I said thank you, and tell him I said not to expect that word again until he's earned it a second time. Tom wrote that down. Third, he showed it to Richard the next morning. Richard read it twice. Uff, he said, and he meant it. The week that followed was the busiest and most uncomfortable of Richard's professional life, which was not something he had expected, since he had been in business for 22 years and had navigated things that should have been considerably worse by any objective measure. Objective measures he was discovering were the wrong tool for this particular job. Acquisition review that he and Patricia conducted turned up 31 cases in 10 years where residential or small business tenants had been displaced through Caldwell Development's property acquisitions. All of them were like Margaret's. Some were straightforward commercial transactions, involved tenants who had been properly compensated and had relocated without incident. 17 of them, 17 involved situations where the displacement had caused material hardship. Those businesses lost livelihoods, families that had moved out of the county entirely, who had simply absorbed the loss and gone on because they had no other choice. 17 Joanna Wyatts. Patricia helped Richard draft letters to each of them. Careful letters, not legal documents, no liability language, no releases, no protective scaffolding, just letters that said, understand that my company's actions affected your life in ways I did not account for. I would like to speak with you, not to offer you a settlement. Listen, 11 of them wrote back. 7 agreed to meet. The meetings were the hardest things Richard Caldwell had ever done. Harder than the parking lot, harder than the call with the Chicago investors, harder even than the conversation with Diane at the kitchen table, because those conversations had at least had the structure of a recognizable human situation, an apology, reckoning, a beginning. These meetings had no structure. They were just people telling him what had happened to them, him sitting across from them, with no defense and no strategy and nothing to offer but the fact of his presence and the quality of his attention. A man named Roy Ballard, who had run a small auto body shop on the west side for 18 years before losing his building to a Caldwell acquisition in 2019, across from Richard in a diner and said, I don't want your money. He said it before Richard even spoke. I just want you to know that I trained 4 kids in that shop. 3 of them work in automotive now. One of them owns his own place. Ours. When you took that building, you didn't just take my business. Ours. You took the place where I was building something that mattered. And I want you to know that. Richard looked at him. I must know that now, he said. I didn't then. And I'm sorry. Roy looked at him for a long time. That, Roy said. Not a question, yes. Roy picked up his coffee. Out the window. He said, my daughter told me not to come. Her. She said, men like you don't change, and meeting you would just make me angry all over again. Richard waited. Wasn't entirely wrong, Roy said. But she wasn't entirely right either. He looked back at Richard. You're doing the thing. That's worth something. Whether it's worth enough, I don't know yet. We'll see. That last sentence, we'll see, became, over the course of that week, the refrain of Richard Caldwell's reckoning. He heard it in 7 different voices, from 7 different people, in 7 different settings. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, just suspension, judgment, just the honest and of judgment from people who had been harmed and were watching to see if the watching was worth their time. It was the most demanding thing anyone had ever asked of him. It required him to perform without an audience, to do the right thing, not because anyone was grading it or filming it or going to report it, but simply because it needed doing. And somewhere in the middle of that week, where parking lot after 5th meeting, Richard Caldwell realized that this was the first time in his professional life that he was doing something that had no clear return. No projection, no metric, no ROI. He sat with that. He called Michael Lawson. Michael answered on the 3rd ring. Mr. Lawson, Richard said, I wanted to let you know I've been reaching out to other people my company's displaced over the past 10 years. I've met with 7 of them this week. Silence on Michael's end. You should know, Richard said, because your mother said something to me in that parking lot that I can't get out of my head. The measure of a life. And I've been trying to figure out what that actually requires of me. I think it requires more than just fixing what happened to her. Michael was quiet for a long moment. And he said, does she know you're doing this? Not yet, Richard said. I'm here to tell you first. Why? Richard thought about it. Because you're the one who showed up, he said. You're the one who made the calls and organized the people and stood in front of my property at 4 a.m. And you didn't have to. You could have let your mother handle it alone. You could have told yourself it was her fight, but you didn't. He paused. I think you deserve to know that the thing you came out there to accomplish, it's working. That not just for her, it's actually working. The line was quiet for a long time. I said, you know what my dad used to say? Tell me. He used to say that character is what you do when the cost is real and nobody's watching. Richard said nothing. Motorcycles are gone, Michael said. Nobody's watching now. I know, Richard said. And keep going, Michael said. He hung up. Richard sat in his car for a moment. Then he looked at the list. Patricia had given him the names and addresses of the 11 people who had written back, of whom he hadn't met with yet. He started the car. He drove to the next meeting. The twist that no one saw coming arrived on a Friday afternoon, 10 days after the parking lot, in the form of a phone call from Warren Hartwell in Chicago. Richard had been expecting this call. He had been steeling himself for it, preparing for the version where the investor pulled out entirely. The financial consequence of the whole Willow Creek situation became concrete and irreversible, and Richard had to stand in front of the full cost of the decision he'd made. Well, Hartwell said. Hartwell, I've been following what you've been doing. I know, Richard said. He had assumed as much. Men like Hartwell always tracked situations they were financially connected to. Reach to the displaced tenants, Hartwell said. The meetings, the review of the acquisition history. Yes, Patricia Odom briefed my team. Richard frowned. Patricia works for me. She does. She also called my team on her own initiative and told them what you were doing. She thought we should know. A pause. She said, I'm quoting here, that you were doing the kind of thing that's hard to do and that doesn't make business sense but makes human sense. In her experience, those were the decisions that either destroyed a man or built him into something worth knowing. Richard was very still. I've been in business for 35 years, Hartwell said. I've worked with a lot of developers, and most of them, when they make a mistake, they'll make mistakes. Most of them find a way to make the mistake smaller in the retelling. They find a way to be the victim of circumstance, or they find a way to make the other party less sympathetic, or they find a way to put the legal language around it until it doesn't look like a mistake anymore. A pause. You didn't do any of that. No, Richard said. I'm going to stay in on Red Valley Commons, Hartwell said. The restructured timeline, the alternative parcel will make it work. I want something in return. Richard waited. I want a community impact review built into every future acquisition, Hartwell said. A real one, not a box-checking exercise. I want to know before we move on any residential or mixed-use property, what is there, who is there, and what happens to them if we move forward. I want that review to have teeth, meaning it can actually stop an acquisition if the impact is severe enough. Richard was quiet. Can you do that? Hartwell said. Yes, Richard said. I was going to propose it anyway. A beat of silence. Hartwell said, yes. Another silence. Caldwell, Hartwell said, and his voice had shifted slightly less of the executive edge, something more human underneath it. Whatever happened to that woman, whatever that jacket meant, I hope you understand that the reason it matters isn't because of the motorcycles. I know, Richard said. It's because she was a person, Hartwell said, and you forgot, and then you remembered. And there are a lot of men in your position who forget and never remember. He hung up. Richard set his phone on the passenger seat. He sat for a long time. Then he drove to Willow Creek Road. He didn't call ahead. He didn't plan what he would say. He just drove there because it seemed like the right place to go when something important had just happened, and he wasn't sure yet what it meant. Pulled to the curb in front of Margaret's house. Their repairs were well underway. Tom's crew had been there all week. The porch was freshly painted. The ramp reinforced. The window trim replaced. The house looked, and this was the word that came to Richard, cared for. The way things look when someone has gone back and paid attention to them after a period of neglect. Whereas he was sitting there, off, not sure whether to knock on the door, when the front door opened and Margaret appeared in the doorway. She looked at his car. She looked at him. She said, on the doorway, loud enough for him to hear through the closed window. Are you going to sit out there all day? He got out of the car, up the newly repaired path to the porch. He stood at the bottom of the steps. I don't have an agenda, he said. I needed to come here. I'm not sure why. Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she said, come in. I'll make coffee. He followed her inside. It smelled like coffee and something baking and wood polish from the repair work. Like a home, specifically like a home that someone had chosen to return to, which is a different smell from a home that has simply been occupied continuously without interruption. Margaret went to the kitchen, and he followed, and he sat at her kitchen table without being told to, like the most natural thing he had done in 2 weeks. Coffee in the way of a woman who has made coffee for people her whole life without ceremony, fuss, efficiently, and with care. She set a cup in front of him and sat across the table, in silence for a moment. How are the meetings going? She said. Perked up. Michael told you. Michael tells me everything. Eventually, she wrapped her hands around her cup. Where are they going? He thought about Roy Ballard, Joanna Wyatt, about the 5 others, about the things they had said, and the things he had not been able to say back. Hard, he said. They're going hard. Good, she said simply. He looked at her. Things that are supposed to be hard should feel hard, she said. When they start feeling easy, that's when you worry. He nodded. They drank their coffee. Outside, a car passed on Willow Creek Road. A dog barked somewhere. The sounds of an ordinary afternoon in a neighborhood that had, for a few days, been the site of something extraordinary. Can I ask you something? Richard said. Go ahead. How do you do it? He looked at her. Bitterness the whole time. Even at the house, he stopped. You never lost it. You never fell apart. Oh. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Who told you I didn't fall apart? She said. But I fell apart plenty, she said, at Sarah's. There? In the middle of the night, when Michael wasn't there to see it, she looked at him calmly. It didn't fall apart in front of you, because falling apart in front of someone who has already decided you don't matter doesn't help anything. It just gives them what they expected. He sat with that. Steadiness, she said, is not something you feel about. It's something you choose over and over every time you want to choose something else. And it gets easier with practice, but it never gets easy. She paused. Me that. He said the bravest thing a person can do is stay calm in the moment when everything inside them is screaming. Richard looked at his coffee. "Ubbs, he sounds like someone I should have known," he said. Her smiled, the real smile this time, the one that reached her eyes. "Was," she said. "He absolutely was." The coffee between them went cold before either of them noticed. So Margaret and Richard ended their first real conversation not with a handshake or a formal conclusion, but with two cold cups and a silence that had shifted somewhere in the middle of it from uncomfortable to something closer to honest. Moradas. Richard left when the light outside the kitchen window went amber, Moradas, which meant the afternoon had passed without either of them tracking it. He said goodbye at the door. Margaret said, "Drive safe," to his car and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. Different from the man who had parked there an hour ago. Formed, not redeemed, just different. The way a bone feels different after it has been set properly after years of sitting at the wrong angle. The same bone, still sore, but pointed in the right direction for the first time. He drove home and told Diane about the conversation. She listened. She asked one question. "Do you think she trusts you?" He thought about it honestly. "Not yet," he said, "but I think she's decided I'm worth watching." Diane nodded. "Better than I expected you to get in 2 weeks," she said. And the way she said it, without irony, without softening, was one of the kindest things she had ever said to him. The Persits. He did not sleep well that night, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness from the nights before. The sleeplessness of a man avoiding something. The sleeplessness of a man who has turned to face a direction he hasn't faced before and is trying to get his bearings. He lay in the dark and thought about Roy Ballard's 4 kids, about Joanna Wyatt's sewing machines. He thought about all the buildings he had raised on top of lives he had never looked at. And he tried not to absolve himself because absolution felt like the wrong goal, but to understand the full shape of what he had built. Asleep somewhere after 2 and woke up at 5 with a clarity that surprised him. What he needed to do next. He called Patricia at 7:15. She answered with the voice of someone who had been awake for a while already. "I want to set up something permanent," he said. "Not a committee, policy document. Something with actual resources and actual teeth." "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "Community Impact Office," he said, "independent of the company. Own board, its own budget, its own staff. Its job is to review every acquisition before it goes forward. No one. And it can say no." Patricia was quiet. "And I want Margaret Lawson on the board," he said. Silence on Patricia's end lasted long enough that Richard checked the line. "Patricia, I'm here," she said. "I'm just making sure I heard you correctly." "You did. You want to put the woman you evicted on the board of the oversight body that reviews your acquisitions?" "Yes." "Richard." Her voice was careful. "Accelerator, that is either the most genuine thing you've ever done or the most calculated. And I need to know which one before I help you build it." He had expected this, had been ready for it since he thought of it at 5 in the morning. "Both," he said, "and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Having her on the board protects her and everyone like her. Also makes the office credible in a way it wouldn't be without her. Both of those things are true at the same time. And I think she's smart enough to know that. And I think if I try to pretend it's only one or the other, she'll see through it in about 4 seconds." Patricia was quiet again. "This time." "Yes," she said, "she will." "So I'm going to go tell her exactly that," he said. "There are things. And let her decide when this morning." "Does she know you're coming?" "No." "Richard, I know. If I call ahead, she'll have a position worked out before I get there. I need her first reaction." Another pause. "You've gotten better at this," Patricia said. "Understanding people." "I had a good teacher," he said. "All of them." He hung up and drove to Willow Creek Road. Tom's crew was already there when he arrived, working on the last of the exterior repairs. The workers saw Richard pull up and gave him a cautious nod, because the whole crew had been briefed on the situation, and none of them were entirely sure how to relate to a boss who had publicly admitted wrongdoing, and was now overseeing the repair of his own mistake. Richard walked to the front door and knocked. Margaret answered quickly, which meant she had been in the front of the house and had probably heard his car. Abyss him. Again, she said. I have a proposition, he said. I want to tell you both sides of it before you answer. She studied him for a moment. Then she moved her wheelchair back from the door. Come in, she said. I just made fresh coffee. He sat at her kitchen table again. She poured 2 cups. She sat across from him and looked at him with that steady, unclassifiable attention and waited. He told her all of it. The Community Impact Office, the independent board, budget, and the authority to stop acquisitions. And then he told her the part about wanting her on the board, and he told her exactly what he had told Patricia, that it was both genuine and strategic simultaneously, and that he was not going to dress it up as only one of those things. When he finished, Margaret was quiet. She looked at her coffee, her cup in her hands the way she had turned it the day before. Then she said, you're telling me it's good for you and good for me at the same time. But you're being honest about that. Yes. Most people would have just told me the good for me part. I know. She was quiet again. Of course. Then, does it matter to you which one it is? What do you mean? Does it matter to you whether you're doing this because it's right or because it helps you? What about he? Does the distinction matter to you personally? He thought about it. Yes, he said. It matters to me. I'd like to believe I would have done it anyway, built the oversight office, changed the process even without the motorcycles, even without any of this. But I don't know if that's true. I'm not going to claim it. What I know is that right now, sitting here, I want it to exist because it should exist. Whether that's enough to count as the right reason, I honestly don't know. Margaret looked at him for a long time. And then she said, Daniel would have liked you. Richard blinked. Looked so surprised. She said, he liked complicated people. Always said simple people were easy to love and hard to learn from. She wrapped her hands around her cup. He would have seen through you the same way he saw through everybody. He would have seen the part underneath too. The part that's trying. Richard did not know what to say to that. He said nothing, which was the right call. I'll think about the board, Margaret said. I'm not saying yes today. I need to talk to... I need to think about what it would actually mean, whether I'd be lending you credibility you haven't fully earned yet, or whether I'd be doing something that actually protects people the way you're saying it would. That's fair, Richard said. I'd be both, she said. I know. She looked at him with something that was almost amusement. You keep saying that, because it keeps being the right answer. She nodded slowly. A week, she said. He gave her the week. It was the longest week he could remember, not because he was anxious about her answer, exactly, but because of what happened during it, which was nothing, and which turned out to be the most clarifying nothing of his life. At work, he met with his team. He reviewed acquisition files and community impact assessments that Patricia had begun building templates for. He had a long conversation with Gerald about the legal structure of the independent board. He drove past Willow Creek Road once, late on a Wednesday evening, not to stop, but just to see the lights on in Margaret's window and know she was there. He did not examine why that mattered to him. He suspected it had something to do with the fact that her being there was proof that something had been corrected, not perfected, not fully resolved, but corrected. The thing that had been knocked sideways had been pushed back toward upright. A small thing. On the 7th day, his phone rang. Margaret's name on the screen. He answered immediately. To Michael, she said, without preamble. What did he say? He said, it sounds like a trap. A pause. Routers. And then he said that if I thought you were genuine, that he trusted my read. What did you tell him? I told him I thought you were a man who did a genuinely wrong thing and is trying to do genuinely right things afterward. And that I've met enough people in my life to know the difference between someone performing redemption and someone actually attempting it. Richard was very still. There, he said, and I told him I'd give you 1 year on the board. There's 1 year, at the end of which I will make my own decision about whether the office is doing what it's supposed to do, whether the no votes are actually being honored when they should be, and whether you're still the same man you are this week. She paused. If the answer to all 3 is yes, I'll stay on. If the answer to any of them is no, talk. And I'll be very loud about why. That's exactly what I want, Richard said. She said. That's why I said yes. She hung up the phone down on his desk and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a man who has just heard something he needed to hear and is giving it the respect of his full attention before moving on. Patricia. She said yes, he told her. Patricia exhaled. A real exhale, the kind that carries actual relief, professional satisfaction. Good, she said. Now don't waste it. I won't, he said. He meant it in a way that he had learned over the past 3 weeks to mean things not as a declaration of certainty, as certainty was what had gotten him into this, as a commitment, a daily choice, the kind of thing that had to be re-chosen every morning because it could not be banked. Community Impact Office opened 6 weeks later. Marauders. The announcement was covered by the Red Valley Courier, by the regional paper, and by 2 of the national outlets that had picked up the original story. Coverage was measured, and appropriately skeptical journalists who had written about accountability being promised had learned to wait before writing about it being delivered. But the details of the office's structure were specific enough that skepticism came with a footnote of cautious interest. It had 7 members, 3 from the local business community, 2 from neighborhood advocacy organizations, 1 former city planner, a woman named Margaret Lawson, listed simply as their community representative Red Valley. When the article ran, Patricia called Richard and read him a comment that had been posted below the online version of the story. It was from a woman named Joanna Wyatt of Canton, Ohio. The comment said, I spoke with Mr. Caldwell 3 weeks ago. He listened for an hour and didn't try once to explain why what happened to me was necessary. That was the first time in 7 years anyone connected to that company listened to me at all. I don't know yet if this new office will matter. But I know that listening was the beginning of something. Watch what happens next. Richard listened to Patricia read it. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, send her a personal note. From me. Tell her we'd like her input on the review process, not formally, or just a conversation with the staff who are building the assessment framework. Tell her she knows things they don't. I'll send it today, Patricia said. In the months that followed was not a fairy tale. It was not a clean arc of redemption with a clear ending point. It was something messier and more real than that, a series of daily choices made by a man who had decided, at 51 years old, to become a different kind of businessman, and who discovered, as most people discover when they attempt to change something fundamental about themselves, that the decision itself was the easy part. The hard part was the Tuesday morning in February when a genuinely attractive acquisition came across his desk, a mixed-use parcel on the north side of Red Valley, commercially zoned, strategically located, with projections that made his financial team almost vibrate with enthusiasm, and he sent it to the Community Impact Office for review before signing anything. The hard part was when the office came back 2 weeks later and said that the parcel included a residential building with 4 long-term tenants, one of whom was an 80-year-old man who had lived there for 40 years and had no family in the county and no clear housing alternative within his income range. The hard part was when Richard looked at the projections and looked at the report and made the call to pass on the acquisition. The financial team was not happy. One of his senior analysts, a young man named Carter, who had been with the company for 2 years and who was very good at numbers and somewhat less good at people, came to Richard's office and said, with the particular frustration of someone who believes in their own logic, well, I understand the optics, but this parcel is a once-in-5 years opportunity, and we're walking away because of one elderly tenant? Richard looked at him. He said his name is Arthur. He's 80 years old. He has no family nearby. We would be displacing a man who has lived in the same place for 4 decades because we want to put a restaurant on the ground floor. Carter opened his mouth. I want you to go to the Community Impact Office, Richard said. I want you to talk to Margaret Lawson. I want you to tell her about the Arthur situation, and I want you to listen to what she says. Love it. Then come back and talk to me. Carter went. He came back 2 hours later. He stood in the doorway of Richard's office, and he looked different from the young man who had left, not dramatically, visibly, but in the specific way of someone who has been told something true by someone they weren't expecting truth from. Told me about a man named Daniel, Carter said. Husband, Richard said. She said he used to say that when you reduce a person to an inconvenience, you don't just harm them, you harm yourself because you practice it and it gets easier. And then one day you look up and it's what you do. He paused. There? She said the day it gets easy is the day you should be most afraid. Richard nodded. Carter stood in the doorway for another moment. We're passing on the parcel, he said. Yes, Richard said. Okay. Carter nodded once. Okay, and he went back to his desk. That was the moment, not the parking lot, not the first cup of coffee in Margaret's kitchen that Richard Caldwell later identified as the one that mattered most. And when someone who worked for him chose differently because of a conversation he had sent them to have, moment when the change became contagious, in the way that real change always eventually becomes, not by announcement, by mandate, but by contact, one person at a time. The last Saturday of that October, exactly 1 year to the month after the eviction, the Red Valley Hells Angels held their monthly chapter ride. It was a long ride the way the fall rides always were, 40 miles out and back on roads that wound through the farmland east of town, through the dry corn smell and the low gold light of a Midwestern autumn afternoon that had no interest in being anything other than what it was. Margaret rode at the center of the formation. She had the trike that the chapter had built for her after her mobility declined, custom-rigged and steady, built to carry her as long as she wanted to ride. Margaret rode on her left, Cannon on her right. The rest of the chapter spread out behind them in the particular formation that the Red Valley chapter had always used, the one Daniel had established, that had never been changed, because some things are preserved not out of sentiment, but out of understanding that they were right the first time. It took 2 hours. When they came back through Red Valley on the return leg, cornerstone, they came down Willow Creek Road, not because it was the most efficient route, because it was her street. Because returning to it at speed and in company was a declaration not of victory, of triumph, but of continuity, of a life that had been interrupted and had resumed. Margaret's porch was in full repair. The ramp was solid. The wind chimes were back. The wooden plaque beside the mailbox said Lawson in letters that Tom's crew had repainted freshly, Margaret's specific request, in the same faded style as before, because she wanted it to look like itself, like new. The formation slowed as it passed her house. There was stop, just to the particular pace that is its own kind of salute, slower than moving on, or faster than stopping, the speed of acknowledgement. Margaret looked at her house from the trike as they passed it. About Daniel. She thought about the morning. A man had stood in her driveway with a folder and a certainty and 2 men in gray polos. About the jacket on the wet ground. She thought about sitting in Sarah's kitchen with a cold cup of tea while 100 engines rolled toward her on the October air. About a man sitting at her kitchen table, not knowing what to do with his hands, and choosing finally to do the right thing with them. About Roy Ballard and Joanna Wyatt and an 80-year-old man named Arthur who was still in his apartment on the north side of Red Valley, still in the place he had lived for 4 decades, because someone had decided that his 40 years mattered more than a restaurant on the ground floor. About her son's hand on her shoulder in a parking lot, her own hand covering his. She thought about Daniel's jacket on the chair beside the dresser, in the room where it had always been, in the house where it belonged. Animation came out the other side of Willow Creek Road and accelerated back to speed. Heard the chapter's end of ride gathering at Michael's shop. Of the engines spread across the neighborhood the way it always had, the particular sound of that particular group of people, recognizable to anyone who had lived in Red Valley long enough to know what it meant. Because we are still here, all of us, together. Margaret rode with them. 2 miles away, in a coffee shop on 4th Street, was sitting across from us a man named Dale Hurst, a former tenant, a 60-year-old tenant whose small printing business had been displaced by a Caldwell acquisition in 2020, and he was listening. He had learned over the course of a year to listen the way Margaret had taught him, to listen not with his next words already forming, with his defense already assembled, but with the full weight of his attention given to the person across from him. Dale was telling him about the print shop, about the smell of ink in the morning, the satisfaction of a job completed well, about the customers he'd had for 20 years, invitations, and the graduation announcements, and the small business cards of people trying to make something of themselves. He was not angry, Dale. That was what surprised Richard, the same thing that surprised him about most of the people he met this year. They were not angry. They were something more complicated and more durable than angry. Oh, they were people who had absorbed a loss and kept going, and who, when given the chance to be heard, chose not to use that chance for fury. Chose to tell the truth. Richard listened. He would drive to his next meeting after this one. He had 2 more this week, another former tenant and a neighborhood association representative who had been trying to get a meeting with him for 3 years. He was working through the list, methodically and without deadline, as the list was not a task to be completed, but a commitment to be honored, and those operated on different timescales. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it. A text from Margaret Lawson. Just 2 words. Photo. The 2 words were, "She's riding." The photo was taken from behind Margaret on her trike. There's at the center of the formation, Willow Creek Road stretching out ahead of them. They're fanned out behind her like a wingspan. Richard looked at the photo for a moment. Then he turned his phone face down on the table and gave Dale Hurst his full attention. Because that was what the year had taught him. That attention was not a limited resource to be rationed according to importance. Every person across from you was the most important person in the room, because they were the person in front of you, and that was enough. It was not finished. It would not be finished, not in a year, not in 5, not in the remaining decades of Richard Caldwell's professional life. Community Impact Office would approve some acquisitions and block others, and there would be fights about both. Margaret would challenge him twice in the first year on decisions he was certain were right, and she would be correct both times, and he would be better for having been corrected. Letter Wyatt would eventually join an informal advisory group that fed information to the Impact Office. Our daughter would call Richard out of nowhere on a March afternoon and say, stiffly but sincerely, that she had been wrong about him, at least partially, and that she thought her father should know. The 80-year-old man on the north side would send Richard a Christmas card, handwritten, 3 sentences about the cold and his health, and a 4th sentence that said simply, "Thank you for letting me stay." Richard kept the card in his desk drawer. He looked at it on the mornings when the old certainty crept back, when the numbers were compelling and the people behind them were easy to forget, and the muscle memory of 22 years of efficiency pulled at him like a tide. And he remembered what the year had built. In the end, was not a redeemed man. That word was too clean. That's too finished, too satisfying for what had actually happened. What it had built was a man in process, a man learning daily and with difficulty to ask different questions. A man who had been shown by a 68-year-old woman in a wheelchair and her son and 100 people who loved them. A measure of a life was not in its transactions, but in its debts, the unpayable kind you accumulate toward people who give you something you didn't know you needed until they gave it. Margaret Lawson had given Richard Caldwell the most uncomfortable and valuable thing one person can give another. She had shown him who he was. And this was the part that stayed with him. He could not account for by any logic he had previously used to understand the world she had given him, the deep chance to become someone better, because he deserved it, not because the 100 motorcycles demanded it. Because that was who Margaret Lawson was, because she had spent 68 years on this earth understanding something that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. Or without mercy is just force. That force without accountability is just fear. And that fear in the end builds nothing that lasts. What lasts is what Daniel Lawson built. What lasts is what Margaret carried forward after him. What is the kind of loyalty that shows up at 4 a.m. without being asked, that stands on a public road in the cold, because standing is the right thing to do, that fills a parking lot with engines and presents, and the simple Irreducible declaration that this person matters. What lasts is the look on a woman's face when she rides down her own street and knows, without question, that the people behind her are there because they chose to be. Well, had spent 22 years building things that were meant to last. Took him 3 weeks to understand that he had never once built anything that would, until now. Not until he sat in a church parking lot and watched 100 people arrange themselves around one woman and understood her and completely what it meant to build something worth keeping. He turned his attention back to Dale Hurst. Dale was still talking. Richard listened. Outside, across town, the formation turned off Willow Creek Road and accelerated into the clear October afternoon. Margaret Lawson rode. At the center of it, the same woman she had always been, town she had always loved, on a road that was still hers and always would be.